afternoon, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Judith Miller, a specialist in French history from the Department of History at Emory University. Professor Miller is a Chevalier in the French Ordre des Palmes Académiques and is one of the co-directors of Emory's European Studies Project. She's a gifted teacher, winning the Emory Williams Teaching Award in 2002. This year, she's on leave at the Emory University Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, where she is working on a book tentatively entitled The Political Uses of Fear in the Late French Revolution, 1794 to 1815. She's been a wonderful collaborator on the Louvre project with our education department, and she's done a variety of things, but you may know her as one of the voices on the audio guide. She provides one of the expert guide voices that you experience in the exhibition. Today she will speak to us about sensational scandals on the eve of the French Revolution. Please welcome Judith Miller.
Greetings, and thank you very much for also. I'm so glad to see so many people here on a holiday weekend as we begin to say our goodbyes to the Louvre Year 1. And I just wanted to say, first off, I always find these microphones a little bit jarring. So if I'm speaking too quickly or too loudly or not loudly enough, please just throw up your hands and signal me. My students who are here know that I run a pretty loose ship in the classroom. I don't mind getting signals. So I'm so happy to be here to talk about my favorite country, France, and one of my favorite centuries, the 18th century. And what could be better than a little bit of scandal, right? Now, 20 or 30 years ago, I could have done the first part of this title, Several Sensational Scandals, but I could not have done the and why they mattered part. And so I'm really happy to get to tell you today about some of the new thinking that's come out in the last 20 or 30 years about exactly why these scandals did matter. And certainly there were a lot of scandals in the 18th century. You may well be familiar with Madame de Pompadour, who is right here. Let's see if I can, there we go. Or we're going to get to the anecdote, the tales of the Comtesse du Barry. May have heard of her. But not all scandals or commotion were necessarily negative. Those of you who are art historians may even recognize this piece here that caused a great stir in 1765 at the Salon. It was sort of the debut piece of Fragonard, who was heralded as the next great history painter. Now, you may be scratching your head, especially if you've been up there and looked at the one Fragonard that we have on view. That's the bathers, those lovely women. But this gives you some sense of the range of technique that Fragonard was displaying. So let's move ahead here. One of the striking things about the 18th century was how much people were reading and how many people were reading. We think that in cities, probably 50% of the men, more than 50%, probably had some level of reading. Women less so, but even a clerk in a shop or a seamstress had to know how to write. Am I getting odd bounce back from? Well, no? Okay. And so here we have one of the many examples of newspapers from the time, and in fact, this is a real estate ad that always figured in newspapers. Whoops. Let's go back one. Well, I just skipped past one that was aimed at women readers. I may have messed this up a little bit, but we'll just keep moving ahead. Some of them were more innocent, fashion magazines, novels. Some of them, as this one shows, were not so innocent. We have The Perverted Peasant Girl, one of the famous novels of the period, and a little print here of a woman urging her lover to walk softly and speak quietly. Now, we know that readings took place both in public. Here is a salon at which an author is testing out one of his new manuscripts, very formal environments, but also that more common people were gathering in restaurants, in reading clubs, in libraries, where they were finding things to read. Now, one of the best gossips that we have from the period is Grimm. If you want to know the backstory to any book that has just come out, what the scandal was at a theater, you head straight to Grimm. And in fact, he was one of the best-selling authors of the time, and a lot of things passed back and forth between letters, and everyone in Europe knew the minute that he had condemned something. We also have Diderot, who for art historians is absolutely essential because he wrote commentaries on the Salon that happened every other year. He was also, of course, the editor, organizer of the Encyclopédie, and this is another work by Fragonard, which while we don't have here, gives you a sense of the other style in which he was able to paint. Now let's go to a rumor of 1750, because we've got a really good gory one here. But first, in order for you to understand it, I need to give you some background on it. The 1750s were an extraordinarily turbulent decade. I often ask my graduate students on their exams, was the French Revolution inevitable by 1750? They can answer it either way, but there's an awful lot that was happening. Of course, there were very important works from the Enlightenment that were published during that decade, a number of concerns about the power of Madame de Pompadour, who was one of Louis XV's mistresses, and a lot of street talk about what the doings at court and in the government. Much of this then centered on the king, Louis XV. Now, when he became king, he was a young man, and everyone was so relieved to see Louis XIV dead and out of it. He had spent an enormous amount of money on war, on court life at Versailles. All the nobles were happy to go racing back to Paris to set up beautiful big mansions there and to be out underneath the thumb of Louis XIV. But by the 1750s, he's no longer the beloved, le bien-aimé. He has instead gotten France into a number of rather difficult tangles. One of the most important ones, the beginning of really the end of the French monarchy, is that he got France involved in an extraordinarily expensive war that also stretched to the New World and even as far as India. And when it all came down to the end of the last peace treaties, France hadn't gotten much out of it at all. It had won a few things, lost a few things, and simply run up enormous debts. It largely concerned whether Maria Theresa, the Austrian empress, could in fact become empress as a woman. And one of the interesting things that comes out of that turbulence and of that war is that with Madame de Pompadour's guidance and advice and pressure, France switches an age-old alliance. It switches from being an ally of Prussia to being an ally of Austria. And of course, now you're starting to think, this is how Marie Antoinette becomes the wife, then, of Louis XVI. There you have it. Well, things did not get any better. A decade later, France was involved in yet another war, the 7 Years' War, again, the first real worldwide war, even in my home state of Ohio, Sandusky, Ohio, across Canada, and in the end, France had lost most of its overseas North American colonies. So devastating impact, extraordinary humiliation, and debt beyond anything that anyone could imagine. As if that were not enough, running up debts, having to pass new taxes that no one liked, the king was involved in the middle of a religious dispute. What could be more sacred to people than the fate of their souls? Well, there was a form of Catholicism that had developed in the 17th century. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called Jansenism. It was a very austere, intellectual form of Catholicism. Went back to Augustine and a lot of Old Testament. And it attracted a following, especially among the intellectual elite, and especially in Paris. The problem was, however, that the Pope in 1713 pronounced that it was a heresy. So suddenly, a large number of Paris's most powerful Catholics are informed that they are heretics. And the king, Louis XIV, and Louis XV after him, decides that they will impose this understanding of Catholicism on the country. This does not make him very happy. This does not make all those Catholics very happy at all. And in fact, some of the people who were most committed to Jansenism were the people who were in charge of what is going to be constitutional in France. All of the judges in the various royal courts around France who, along with the king or even above the king, got to say what was constitutional. And you'd better believe that they decide that the Pope's bull was not constitutional And on top of that, the king's new taxes are not constitutional. And finally, what Louis XV has to do is even suspend some of these courts and send these judges off into exile in provincial cities. And last time I spoke here and with my students, I always say this is a little bit like taking a disgruntled faculty with lots of learning, many books, and saying, go off for about 3 or 4 years, set yourself up on unpaid leave. What do? They get with their books, they write different tracts, they do research on all the reasons the king is wrong. So when they're finally recalled, they're ready to go. They've got their arguments together. So we can see by the 1750s, Louis XV is in real trouble. Now back to this rumor, and here we have, one of the chroniclers has told us this. So for the past week, it is said that police constables, disguised, are roving in different neighborhoods and kidnapping children, girls and boys up to age 10 and older, and they are putting them into hired coaches that they have standing ready. Parents are madly keeping their children at home. Women and men are starting to attack any police constable that comes down the street, and it's going to get even worse here. Barbier goes on to tell us that it is being said that the object of these child enlèvements, kidnappings, is that there is a, get this, leprous prince who needs a bath or baths of human blood for his care. And as there is no blood purer than that of children, they have been taken and bled from all extremities and sacrificed, which revolts the people even more. You can understand why people were busy pulling their children back in off the street, and why there were days and days of riots in central Paris in 1750. Now, who was, of course, that leprous prince? None other than Louis XV. And, of course, you can sense that this scandal is also going to be about Madame de Pompadour, his mistress. He was a prince who occasionally roused himself to govern and to face down the Parlement and send them into exile and to pass new taxes that were unconstitutional. But largely this was a man who was not interested in governing. He enjoyed the pleasures of the court, fine dinners, many women, a long string of aristocratic mistresses. But he was increasingly criticized to the point when he's passing new taxes that are not constitutional for having spent the country's money just so conspicuously and so corruptly. So by the 1750s, he's not loved. And in fact, an awful lot of the criticism focuses on Madame de Pompadour. And here we see her in some of her most famous images, both by Boucher, who's one of the main painters that she uses. She was a very accomplished and intelligent young woman. She had a very shady background. We'll get to that in a second. But she was not at all an aristocrat. In fact, she comes out of the world of French finances, awful, corrupt, crass, high-living, bankrupt one day, rolling in money the next, French finances. And there was a lot of money to be made at this time through wars, colonial expansion, the slave trade. And in fact, some of you, if you followed the Tony Parker-Eva Longoria marriage this summer, you know that they had their reception at Vaux-le-Vicomte, which is associated with one of the most spectacularly rich financiers of Louis XIV, who had actually to be sacked in 1661 so that Louis could confiscate this and grab his wealth. They had an appalling habit of aping the manners of the aristocrats, having even more money than aristocrats, and setting them up in very fine surroundings. Whoa. And indeed, we have here someone who is a very prominent member of the major financial groups that's supporting the king. Crozat, he actually has the trade monopoly in Louisiana for a few years. Art historians know him because he and his brother put together a fabulous art collection and were busy patronizing a lot of artists who were not necessarily able to make it in the world of stuffy academic art. They often would buy spectacularly expensive offices from the king. The secrétaire du roi was one of the really big scandals of the period. There were 1,200 of them by the time of the Revolution. They did virtually no work. They were just supposed to prepare royal paperwork for different things. But a financier could plop down the money for that office, immediately become noble, not just himself, but all of his progeny, providing he held on to the office for 20 years. And they had a habit of dressing very nicely. Here he's actually giving the impression that he's doing some work. That's very good. And this brings us to the heart of the group, then, from which Madame de Pompadour came. These are the Paris brothers, based in Paris. This guy is the oldest of the four brothers, and he was rumored to be 7 feet tall. And here is the man who might have been, he's one of the possibilities, to be Madame de Pompadour's father, Jean-Paris de Montmartel. Although it's more likely that this man, who's also a financier, was her father. And in fact, her father had suffered an enormous disgrace, a huge bankruptcy, all sorts of corruption, and he was even tried, sentenced to death by hanging, and ended up simply escaping from the country and hanging out in exile for a while. And while he was away then, the Normand de Tournem stepped in, had a relationship with the lovely mother who doesn't look so young and lovely here, but he may well have been Madame de Pompadour's father. And he steps in as guardian to her family and eventually marries her to his nephew. He saw that she got an extremely fine education. She was a gifted musician, both singing and playing the harpsichord, and for a woman of that period was very interested in literature and the arts, and she became even more so as she grew older. Here we have a picture here at the High that I hope you've been enjoying this year. She was very, very conscious, however, of her image. And this actually comes from, and I think it originates not with her trying to shape her image as a beautiful young woman that the king is in love with. This probably originated with a design that Louis XV, as he was working to seduce her, had produced early on. This is a later version of it here that I managed to find. He heard her play the harpsichord at a ball and fell immediately in love with her. She had been in Parisian society, showing up at many of the salons. She's very wealthy. She's got Tournem, the whole Paris brothers, behind her, and he is struck with love for her. But of course, she's not a member of the aristocracy. She's from that commoner group of financiers that periodically buys aristocratic titles. But here we have the story of a young man who's in love. Anyways, hold on to that. A young man who is in love, who has come to, disguised as an old lady, to woo this young woman. And indeed, here it is, reproduced as a Gobelin tapestry. You perhaps walked past this upstairs in the High. You might want to go back and take another look, because this is one of the works that celebrates the beginnings of their great affair. And she was, in fact, constantly retooling her image, showing, always with her roses, all sorts of things to sort of declare her love and her fidelity and her great beauty, so that Louis XV would not forget this. Here's another such image, this one, also by Boucher, very late, after she was no longer Louis XV's lover, but indeed simply keeping that memory alive for him. By about 1750 onward, we think that she was largely his confidant and advisor, no longer at all his lover. He was on to younger and prettier things. But as part of her image reworking, she ends up really becoming a patroness, a commissioner of all sorts of different works. Gets very involved with the Gobelin tapestry, gets them back off the ground. Sèvres porcelain, and these are on display here at the High, with, of course, little cupids by none other than, of course, Boucher. Here is a table that we have on display, this is from slightly after her period, but her style of having Sèvres porcelain inserted. She was a very talented engraver herself, and this is an engraving that she produced. Here's a letter in her own hand to Voltaire. So she's very conscious of it. You got to rework your image once you get over age 30. And here we have her with some lithographs, some other items showing her love of music. If you ever get a chance to see this, you can read down the list of books. All of these are by artists or by other people that she is sponsoring. Nearly all of her late paintings have in one way or another a reference to her work as patroness of the arts. And finally, one last image of her just before her death. It was completed after her death. Indeed, the obligatory table with the Sèvres inlay by one of her cabinet makers absolutely has the books there. She's doing crewel work, something that's more appropriate for a woman of her age and in her poor health. And, of course, always a dog, which represents not only friskiness and sexuality, but loyalty. So even on her deathbed, she is still loyal to Louis XV, even though they haven't been lovers for 14 years. Now, of course, there were criticisms of Pompadour that she was getting Louis XV into sort of the worst excesses and not reining him in at all. And, of course, there was the issue of all the chateaux that she was managing to buy, especially her chateau out at Ménard on the Loire. But also she has the chateau that has become the presidential palace, right off the Champs-Élysées in Paris. If you see, President Sarkozy now going in and out of the royal residence, or the presidential residence, that was originally one of the places that she lived. Now, here's a little bit of dirt we have here. This is, and you remember perhaps, oh dear, I just messed it up. Let's see if I can go back. No, I'm not going to be able to go back. Okay. Nope. It's not. The little mouse thing isn't staying. There we go. Okay. You don't know how often this happens in the classroom. Okay, I'll try to keep my finger off of that button. Her maiden name was Poisson, which of course means fish. Okay? So, here we have a commentary on that diplomatic revolution that she and a certain member of the clergy here, Berny, had really pushed Louis toward. And the writing here basically goes, regardless of the amount of Roman purple that we have out here these days, the only thing that Paris really has is a big fat fish. Here we have a special pomade made for the lips of Madame de Pompadour. Not very nice. If you think that political cartoons are bad today, you haven't seen the 18th century. You just haven't. There's nothing that Then here we have one of the verses that was told about her. It reads, daughter of a bloodsucker, and bloodsucker herself, fish of an extreme arrogance. She spreads about, displays in this chateau, about Bellevue, her chateau, without fear and without fright, the substance of the people and the shame of the king. I wish I could make it rhyme, but it's just not going to rhyme. Okay? But these kinds of writings and pamphlets are just everywhere, and you keep stumbling across them everywhere in the 18th century. Now, Diderot took a more elevated path, but he was disgusted by or found that the work of Boucher, all those frilly cupids and angels, the luxuries of the court, were just highly corrupt and immoral. Here's what he has to say about her favorite painter. Of course, I don't know what to say of this man. The degradation of taste, of color, of composition, of characters, of expression, of design has followed step by step the deprivation of morals. And here we find a painting that we might have written off 20 years ago as part of that whole degradation of morals. But this is the Fragonard that we do have here this summer, and it's one of the most glorious works, I think, of the 18th century. If you look here, you'll notice that we, oh, darn, I did it again. Let's see. I'm pushing it up. I'm just not getting it. There we go. Oh, no. Well, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. This was the guy who did that big history painting that was the big commotion of 1765. But what we have here is these nymphs bathing, almost blending into nature, mimicking it. You almost don't know where one body ends and the next begins. This is a kind of art that we might have looked at and go, oh, it's just more of that Cupid stuff. But there's been a revision of our understanding of Fragonard, that he was really painting for connoisseurs who knew every little bit of his painting or of the style. So that, for instance, the way in which this cloth trails here, with just a suggestion of where it's going, or of these leaves here, a suggestion of what lies just above them, would be everything to a connoisseur. And the way in which the brushwork almost has an unfinished quality is almost like a woman who at the end of the day is getting ready to receive someone and throws on a peignoir with a studied casualness that you know took her an hour to pull off. It is that kind of art, and his mastery, not just of this technique, but as you get to know Fragonard's work, every piece is somewhat different. He had the technical expertise to pull off any kind of painting. Now let's go back, however, to the 1750s, because things are only going to get worse here for poor Louis XV. On one day in 1757, riding a carriage into Paris, one of the last times he ever goes there, he steps out, and Damien, who is mixed up with a family that has something to do with those Jansenist parlementaires, thrusts a dagger into his chest. An assassination attempt on the king. Can't get much worse than that. And in fact, the whole plot unravels, and one finds various Jansenist fingerprints all over it. Damien is given then the execution that is only for those who have executed or attempted to execute the king. The king makes it through that. The next day he's up and around, so he's fine. Don't worry about Louis XV. But poor Damien is drawn and quartered, has boiling oil and wax and lead poured into the wounds, and then this is the quartering part, is pulled apart by horses. And you can see the crowds coming here for the spectacle, and a little bit more on the kind of torture that went into this. This then gets people really thinking about the need to get rid of the French death penalty, actually. That this is just too awful and hideous a thing to do. Now, if an assassination attempt isn't bad enough, then there's the last famous mistress, Madame du Barry. She absolutely beguiled the king. She was known for being very sociable, very charming, not at all intellectual, not at all like Madame de Pompadour. We know about her beginnings. They were very humble. She was probably the illegitimate daughter of a woman who was either a seamstress or a washwoman, who then managed to capture the eyes of a rather wealthy man who gave the young Madame du Barry a good education. She set off for Paris, got work in as a seamstress, and utterly fell in love with the clothing, and because she was so beautiful, she quickly caught the eye of a rather wealthy man who became kind of her sponsor then, and very quickly she had captured the eye of the king and become then his last mistress. And it's really with her that we can see the kinds of lavish entertaining that is going on. This is a particular mansion that was built for her, and another Fragonard painting. Completely different style, yet again, the progress of love. Well, she too, like Pompadour, was extremely image conscious and wanted to go with the latest fashions and even set the fashions. And here we have her dressed as a man. And you can just imagine the tongues that got wagging about this. Louis XV is in love with a man. What's happened? All the young women at court are looking at this young man. What does this say about the morals of the court? And indeed, then, one of the most famous books that is written about her is done by a guy who's pretending to be an historian. He goes out and he interviews people, and he gets all of the dirt, but then he presents it in a very elevated tone. Well, of course, dear reader, I've heard this awful thing about her, but perhaps we should pass on because I know you've heard the same rumors, but I can't quite make them true. I don't quite know. So let's go on to the next. I've got a founded rumor for you. Well-founded. I have it on very good evidence. And the book just rolls through her life then with this very salacious tone, but very elevated tone at the same time. But this was very quickly a bestseller. And we think that it had a tremendous impact on people's thinking about the monarchy, because suddenly they were privy to all the secrets, very well-evidenced documentation for everything. Now, people weren't just reading about Madame du Barry. What we know about the 18th century is that something that the historians now call the public sphere was developing. Very broad readership on all sorts of different topics. Here we have the Foire Saint-Germain in Paris, which was where salons and exhibitions were held. All sorts of theater was here, and people were constantly reading then reviews and getting involved in what was going on in the world of the arts. And here we have simply two of the very highbrow opera and the Italian, the Comédie Italienne, which was a rival of the Comédie Française. But the interesting thing is what was happening in the audience. The stage was fine, good, have the lovers run around, have your second act ballet. The real show was increasingly down there in the orchestra. It's called the parterre. Young men and women would show up, often rowdy, sometimes soldiers on leave, and they would begin commenting on what was going on stage. They might say, she looks like a virgin, but we know she's not. Or they would, if they didn't like the second act ballet, they would jump up on the benches and they would start mocking the people who were dancing. And if the police came in to try to get them to settle down, because police always are trying to get people to settle down, they would then enact their whole big theater down there. So if you went to the theater in the 1760s or 1770s, you might be interested in what's going on stage, that you'd be going to see what kind of commotion there was. And things got so bad that by the 1770s, can you imagine this, if this audience needed this, the police had to post one soldier for every 3 members of the audience around most of the theaters. Yeah. Now, we could just look at this and say lots of commotion, lots of rowdy soldiers, lots of working class guys. But historians have taken another look at this, and they see something very interesting happening. And that is that there is a contest going on between the people who run the theater, between the rich aristocrats and the critics sitting up in the loge, and what's going down in the parterre. And the question is, who gets to judge? And whose judgment should prevail? And if you stop and think about it, and you start looking for the origins of democracy, we think that there is something going on there in theater and art audiences when they are saying, no, we're not going to listen to the authorities. A particular, a baker from the 5th arrondissement, I have the right to say whether this piece is good or bad or not. There's a really important transformation. It's not just guys jumping around on benches. And in fact, here are some of the more scatological and more humorous things that will happen at the Comédie Italienne. And you can just imagine how people will respond to some of these goings on. Now, here's a little scandal that we couldn't talk about anywhere else right now, but right here at the High Museum. We've got a domestic scandal to roll out for you. We've got several players here. And yes, if you know the Fanny Ardant film, Ridicule, that is Fanny Ardant. Now, one of the unfortunate things that happens to the poor people who are at the center of this scandal is that 1769 saw the widespread emergence of lots and lots of art criticism. And here we have some things by Monsieur Raphael with the elevated title of painter of the Academy of Saint-Luc. That's a rival group to the established group. Blah, 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 blah. To his friend, Monsieur Jérôme, his friend, Miller of Tobacco and great drinker. And we have the response of Monsieur de Jérôme. There are tons of these guys writing. They will go through the salon. They'll discuss whether or not that model really is a natural redhead or a blonde. There aren't too many women who really are, but they seem to be disproportionately present among the models of painters. They'll talk about what the dead animals in a still life think about being hunted down, trussed up, and dangled above a table. Okay? And there was a lot to talk about at the 1769 one. This is one of the works that created a real stir by a guy who'd gotten his reputation for doing very moralistic family scenes, and suddenly he decided he's going to rival people like Poussin and come out with this classical history scene. It is laughed at. It is a humiliation for Greuze. He goes back to painting sentimental scenes. But now into our domestic drama. Here we have a young man in Rome getting somewhat older and older still, and still, to his sister's despair, not married. The rumors that we have, the gossip that we have from the various writers, are either that he was charming, elegant, great fun to be with, or that he was moody, brutal, taciturn, even paranoid, and certainly not good company. You didn't want him at the dinner table. And his sister tried hard to get him to marry. She paraded any number of young aristocratic and non-aristocratic women, great wealth, great beauties all. But he kept saying, I'm only going to marry for love. I will not marry until I have fallen in love. Although he was a grand libertin who had many, many women in his lives before he finally meets. And I've deliberately blurred her face here, because her background is as murky as she turns out to be. He finally lights upon a 15-year-old from a family of financiers who it is rumored was belle comme un ange. She was as beautiful as an angel, lively, witty, sweet, a perfect match for this 41-year-old. Yes, I can't imagine what she thought of this, but we're going to find out. So he marries her. And in fact, there's even this nice little rumor in the background that she might well be one of the illegitimate daughters of Louis XV. It's more likely she was an illegitimate daughter of a financier. She had a mother who was a great beauty. So they get married in December. The wedding takes 3 weeks, and the last parts of it are down at a chateau that he has. Even the whole court comes down. And within a few months, she finds out that her mother, that great beauty, is ill, and she'd like to accompany her mother to Aix-la-Chapelle, which is one of the great spas of the period. And there he brings her on down with her mother, with some of her friends, with some of his friends, and he quickly then departs to go look at art somewhere else. But even along the road, we find out from another one of these great 18th century gossips that they hadn't gotten but a few miles down the road that he began to get very worried and anxious and even paranoid about what she might do. And indeed, by the time he has come back from his art trip, there is a scene of domestic unhappiness that unfolds. He comes back in the very first night, very publicly, in front of everybody else. He finds out that she's had a very, very good time without him. I think any 16-year-old with a 41-year-old husband who's finally been turned loose, with her mother, who's had Louis XV as a lover, she's had a fine time in Aix-la-Chapelle. Her mother's doing better. And he tears into her with everybody's eyes on her, saying that he knows full well why she brought him here and why she dispatched him the way she did to go look at art. He knows what she's been up to. Well, of course, she goes racing out of the room. He goes racing out of the room. Everybody's watching this. There are attempts at reconciliations, but nothing ever brings the two of them back together. She was pregnant at the time. She loses that baby. She then has another child that dies in infancy. Terribly difficult for her. But the two of them never get back together. And finally, then a few years later, they have what is in the 18th century a divorce. They have an official separation, and he works everything out so that she can't get any of the money in any of the houses, and definitely not that chateau. Well, she goes on to have a rather long and public affair with one of the most eligible bachelors around. He's a cardinal from a very important family. He's got quite a career behind him. I wouldn't say that the church had been his vocation, but he was a writer who was a member of the Académie Française. He had been sent as a special ambassador to Vienna, and he was even the king's confessor and the person who was in charge of religion for the royal household. Well, by the 1770s, they have a very hot and very public affair going. Her husband dies. She eventually marries someone else. She even outlives all of them, gets all the property, and ends up living through the revolution. And by now, you're maybe wondering what the connection is to the high. But here we have, yeah, you guessed it, right? Here we have the happy couple. Roughly a year after all the rumors had been circulating of exactly what had happened at Aix-la-Chapelle. Okay. We're going to come back to this painting. We'll get another shot at it, but I just quickly want to show you. Here we have Poisson as a young man in Rome, and Marigny, once he gets his title, he is, of course, the man who helps to generate or create the Louvre, his official painting. And here is their beautiful chateau that had belonged to the Marquis de Pompadour. Back to this painting, though. Looks like any household scene, does it not? She's getting dressed in the morning. They're talking about what they're going to do for the day. She's pointing very gracefully to this phallic symbol of male authority. Well, you can just imagine what Jérôme and Raphael and others have to say about this painting by the time the scandal has broken. And indeed, it is greeted with laughter and catcalls. Diderot reports that the public has found that in general, the composition had the air of a regrettable domestic scene in which, and I'll finish up here, a worried husband questions his wife and tries to make out in her expressions the truth or the falseness of her replies. And where the woman is playing magnificently with superiority at all her intrepidity, or with intrepidity. A nasty story that has, for a while, a little while before, spread through the city, has shown that in this painting, what one would never have figured out if you had not known before. And then it becomes even worse, that other people are commenting on her toilette and saying, in fact, well, I think that some here have found his posture and his attitude rather poorly captured. And the conversation of the two married people, the two spouses, has nothing lively, absolutely nothing. In a word, simply a true conversation between a husband and wife. But for me, I'm touched by the charming grace of the young woman, the attention that her husband is taking to try to fix on her charge, to establish what the truth is, and the details of her dress that give the illusion to the eyes. Of course, you can just hear the sarcasm off of that, flowing off of that. And finally, Jérôme even says, well, actually, I really know this couple because I am the guy who mills the tobacco for the valet of the household, and I tell you, they're respectable people, and they only like respectable people, and that's the way I like the people I work for. Now, of course not. And there's even, I've come across some evidence that they even had to pull this picture down out of the Salon of 1769 because it absolutely could not support the public commentary. Okay. Now, one last affair here, the diamond necklace affair, which I think a number of you know about, with Marie Antoinette, that breaks forth. And one of the things we have to know about this is that the reading materials were not just pornographic novels, not just newspapers, but that we have all sorts of court cases. This is court TV for the 18th century. You got an adultery case, you know, if you're the lawyer, that you're going to get about a press run of maybe 150,000 out of a good adultery case. Okay, you're going to make a killing on the sales. And in fact, look at this. This is actually a précis for a court case put together by one of the lawyers who's the most inventive with this. And doesn't this look, it's an adultery case, doesn't this look more like a novel than a court case? And indeed, the blurring between fiction and literature, or between fiction and the law, is immense during this period. And in fact, here we have a case that broke in right about the same time for adultery, seduction, defamation on behalf of Sir Colonman against his wife, other people, and who do we have here but Beaumarchais? And this is all breaking as Marriage of Figaro is being opened. Okay. So here we have poor Marie Antoinette, who, before she was queen, had heard of this beautiful necklace that had been offered first to Louis XV for Madame de Berry. Louis XV said, no, can't afford it, don't dare buy it. It was then offered to Marie Antoinette, and she too had to turn it down, but everybody knew that she really still wanted this necklace. And indeed, there was a woman at court who had a long but illegitimate royal pedigree, a completely ruined noble family, who's figured out how she's going to get some money. And she knows that, who is this guy again? The Cardinal, the same guy from the Marigny scandal. He gets around. She knows that he's fallen out of grace with Marie Antoinette, and so she tells him, along with her conspirators, if you'll go buy that necklace yourself and pay for it and then turn it over to Marie Antoinette very discreetly, meet her in a garden at night, she'll see that you get repaid, she'll have the necklace, everybody will be happy, nobody has to know. And he's desperate to get back in her good graces, so he says yes. And indeed, there's a garden meeting, and a young actress is hired to play the part of Marie Antoinette. Of course, the necklace is grabbed, quickly cut up, sold off, and with Valois and her group pocketing all the money. And of course, poor Rohan is running around the court trying to get some sign from Marie Antoinette that she's very grateful. And he's not getting repaid by her either. And he's trying to figure out, well, eventually this all ends up in court. And what we find then is not just a few press runs, but enormous numbers of press runs with the different parties presenting these as fictional accounts. And indeed, this looks more like theater, doesn't it, than it looks like politics. Okay. But the damage was done. Marie Antoinette did everything she could to try to bring her image back as a good mother. No one really would believe that she had nothing to do with the diamond necklace affair. And in fact, by the time we get to the Revolution, these are the kinds of political pornography that is being shown. Here we have Marie Antoinette with the hand of Lafayette, General Lafayette, who is trying to encourage her to accept the Constitution that the revolutionary government has. But we can't make it out here. There's some writing there that says that this is the res publique. Now, if you know your Latin, you know that that is the origin of the word republic. But it also is the public thing, as in the public woman thing. And those of you who know French know what the first syllable of Constitution is, and that is the title of this work. And we have a little extra, just in case you didn't get the point, okay? And it keeps getting worse. Here we have pictures of Marie Antoinette with her ladying and waiting. I tell you, even the Senator Craig scandal can't get this good. And by the time we have Marie Antoinette then in the Revolution, she's being accused even of incest with her son and led off for execution. With terrible verse, here we have one that is about how Rohan Collier, the guy with the necklace, he's also the one who picked her up at the border when she came to marry Louis XVI. And look what he did to her in the carriage on the way to Paris before the king, who had the veto power in the Constitution, never knew a thing. So yes, he got around. Now, where I want to sort of end here is a reflection on what the relationship is between scandals and human rights, because this is where we come to the "and why this matters" point. And I tell you, it is somewhat mixed. You think of all of those awful portrayals of Marie Antoinette, and that at the root of it was a fair amount of misogyny, and the idea that a woman had nothing to do, or should have nothing to do, with the state. And so while we can think of the Revolution as being a period of, in some cases, great celebration at the beginning of it, where people are actually starting to put into the work some form of democracy, we also think of the great levels of violence and also violence against women that was part of the Revolution, trying to figure out how that happened. It's the execution of Louis XVI. There were some voices that championed women. One of them even wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Women in 1791. She got herself caught on the wrong side, the wrong political faction, though, and was executed. We have all sorts of examples of women trying to find their political voice during the Revolution, and even under some of the revolutionary laws, being allowed to get divorced. In fact, more women than men sued for divorce with the revolutionary legislation. And for the first time, they were allowed to own property in their own name and inherit equally with their brothers. You can imagine what the brothers, though, thought about that. And indeed, within a few years, all of the awful things that had been written about women and women in power end up with a civil code of 1804, in which women then were stripped once again of their right to own property in their own name or to sue for divorce except in absolutely extreme circumstances. Now, the thing that historians have seized upon here is a new kind of sort of emotional, sentimental literature that is developing. Some of it is like this Fragonard, painting sensual, sexual nature. But we know that it's showing up in all sorts of different settings. Young women writing letters, reading letters. Young women especially reading novels, moral or not. And what's important about this work, the other Fragonard, is the way in which she is identifying with the author. She's thinking her own thoughts. She's responding to that book. Or, as we have here on display at the High, we have this intense focus. He's lost in his own little world. A world of morality in some cases, a world of perhaps of immorality in others. But we think that there is something going on with the way in which people are reading and starting to access some deeper interior life. It was not without fear for some people. A woman reads, and of course she loses her top, or a man reads, and of course he ends up in bed, of course. Or a young woman who appears to be crying over her bird is actually, according to Diderot's comment on this painting, crying over a lover that she has lost her virginity to. And certainly Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the great writer of this new style, in which he was portraying himself. Here are all of my sins and all of my faults, and I know you, dear reader, you have those same faults. And we can form a true, transparent bond, the two of us. And I will feel for you, and you will feel for me. And it's that feeling of sympathy or empathy that we think is really key here. And do we think that this even then, that feeling of sympathy, that ability to put yourself in someone else's place, actually is part of the reaction then that comes when a Protestant is broken on the wheel, supposedly for murdering his son? He did not do it. But that all the barbarity of that caused a lot of French Catholics to say, you know, even a Protestant should not be treated that badly, a number of people rushed to his defense, and here we have the publication of memoirs and plays around the life of Jean Calas. But look at the things that Voltaire managed to get produced. Here is the couple saying goodbye before he's off to be broken on the wheel and subjected to a hideous execution. Here is the reading of the death sentence. These are works that are absolutely generated to make the reader care and to draw on that feeling of sympathy and empathy. We think that there also might be some relationship to that, between that feeling of empathy around issues of the slave trade and the abolition of the slave trade. And in fact, it makes it possible to envision a black delegate coming and being elected to the Estates General in France. And we know that there are so many of the colonial goods that were part of European wealth that were produced in absolutely barbaric conditions of slavery, and that all the great cities, especially port cities, whether it's Charleston, Nantes, Boston, Bordeaux, Liverpool, Richmond, were fed by the slave trade and by slave production. Even Boston wants to get in on the Caribbean sugar trade. And indeed, slaves and goods are crisscrossing, and during this period, interesting things happen. The number of slaves is increasing during the being transported, is increasing during the Enlightenment. And very curiously, more and more women and children are being pulled on board ship as slaves and brought to the New World, because the idea is male slaves are proving to be too rebellious, and they want to have more docile women slaves and children as slaves. They find, though, that they get even more slave revolts on board ships, and the thinking is, with women, because they didn't expect the women to be violent, and they let them wander freely around the ship. And indeed, we've got some rather enormous slave revolts that happen during this period. And here is one of these images that certainly plays on sympathy and emotion, and that would have moved someone, that reader sitting alone next to her fireplace, to ponder whether the slave trade was a good thing or not, and to see the barbarity of plantation labor. But one wouldn't want to say too strongly that it is sympathy that causes a number of proclamations to end the slave trade during the middle of the French Revolution. One can certainly say that it played a part. Unfortunately, in the French colonies, it all came to naught in 1802 when Napoleon brought troops back and reimposed slavery on just about all parts of the Caribbean except for Haiti, that managed to resist him. And this was the leader of the Haitian Revolution. Now, I just want to close with a couple comments on how this all connects to the Revolution and perhaps to some of the worst excesses of the Revolution. Because for all of those memoirs that were being produced, they kept using one familiar trope. I am a poor, innocent victim. I have been oppressed by the powerful, rich, and corrupt. See me, I am without vice. All the vices are over there. That was how those memoirs of the different court cases developed. But here we have, in some of the greatest oratory by one of the leaders of the Revolution, Robespierre, that same rhetoric, but calling for some of the excesses of the Revolution, arbitrary arrests, executions. But what have we here is, because it gives us victory of truth over deception, the rights of public interest over private interest, all of those same kinds of binary oppositions. Our weakness, because it rallies against all men who are vicious, all those who in their hearts plan to despoil the people, and so on and so forth. We must smother the internal and external enemies of our republic or perish in this situation. The first maxim of your policy ought to be to lead the people by reason and the people's enemies by terror. So when I said that there's a mixed package in this sentimental language, this idea that there are poor innocent victims with whom we might identify, well, who gets left out of that? You can very quickly say anyone that's not on your side is on the side of vice and corruption. And so I simply leave you with that mixed package that comes out of these scandals as it led toward, I think, the terror. So I will finish up there. Thank you for being patient. I know I ran a little bit long. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. We will now take a few questions from the audience. I just want to mention that we will ask that you speak into the microphone because this lecture is being filmed for the Atlanta Forum Network. And fortunately for you, you can visit the Atlanta Forum Network at www.atlantaforumnetwork.org and see this lecture in case you want to catch up on any of these scandals that Judith has mentioned. Are there any questions? Yes.
I came a little late, so I don't know if you tackle the subject, but I have always wondering, what's the perception of homosexuality during that time?
It's complicated. One would start first by saying there isn't something that is homosexuality understood the way we do today, as a category of sort of human, of your personal identity. Instead, there were many different acts. Some of them were categorized as sodomy. That's the usual category. And there could be rather nasty, brutal repression if someone was caught. However, it's usually the people that get caught and thrown into prison or executed for sodomy. It's few and far between. They're mostly in the lower classes. Among the aristocracy, it was usually seen, I'm not a specialist on this area, and there may be some people who are. My understanding is that it's seen not that you are homosexual or lesbian, but instead that you have simply a huge amount of sexual urges, and that they have to be fulfilled somewhere. So if you can't find a man or a woman, you will express them in other ways. And of course, we all know that Marie Antoinette, the marriage was not consummated for a rather long time because Louis XVI had a deformity that had to be remedied. And so there were all these rumors that started running, not just that she was having affairs with men, but that she was such a nymphomaniac that she was having affairs also with women.
Other questions?
Yes.
All of that literature that was against the monarchy, are we to understand that France had a free press, or was that underground stuff that was brought out?
It's quite underground. There are printing presses, especially over near Geneva, just across in Switzerland, across the border, and also up in Amsterdam. A lot of it is smuggled in. We know a lot about the networks of smugglers. Yes. But there were also ways in which you could get it published if you had the right person in charge of the censorship. In fact, Madame de Pompadour, as patron to literature, saw that a number of works were published, and things were somewhat freer under her guidance.
Is there one more question before we leave? No? Okay. Judith has very thoughtfully put together a handout with books that you can find more, you can read and find more information on all these scandals. And I think some of them are about the slave trade during that time.
And I'll also mention quickly that the author of one of them is listed, and she doesn't know this, is Denise Davidson, who is a specialist on women under Napoleon and teaches at Georgia State University. She's right here today. So if you've got any questions about Napoleon and Josephine, she's the one.
Okay, great, thank you. And that handout will be on the table as you leave, so please feel free to grab one of those. Thank you all for coming, and Judith, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for coming.